The Illuminate Arts and Faith Conference in Chattanooga, Tennessee wants to help you find your tribe. Do you get way too excited about quoting Wendell Berry or C.S. Lewis in conversations with coworkers? Does your Spotify playlist include hymns, a little jazz, and a whole lot of Andrew Peterson? Join your tribe at Illuminate March 31 and April 1 for education and inspiration from speakers Russ Ramsey, Douglas McKelvey, John Hendricks, and others. Find a complete list of session topics and ticket information at southern.edu/illuminate.
In 2024, I set out to meet as many poets as I could and spend an hour with each one. I got more than I bargained for, more insight, more clarity, more hope. It's proved to be one of the richest highlights of my life. 17 writers, 17 deeply human conversations that made me sit up and pay attention. Franz Kafka once said, if the book we're reading doesn't wake us up with a blow to the head, what are we reading for? A book must be the axe for the frozen sea within us. And that's what I hope this new book will do. I hope it wakes us up, my friends. I hope these conversations will be the catalyst for something to be reawakened, re-enchanted, and reinvigorated. It's called An Axe for the Frozen Sea, Conversations with Poets About What Matters Most. I'm Ben Palpin, and I hope you'll come and listen in as I spend a little time with poets like Lucy Shaw, Malcolm Guite, Dana Gioia, and Lee Young Lee. Pull up a chair at the table as we dig into what it means to write well and to live well. An Axe for the Frozen Sea is now available from Rabbit Room Press. Visit the store at rabbitroom.com, or better yet, ask about it at your favorite bookseller.
I think if any of us waited for that inspiration to fill the sails, we might be waiting for a long time. I think life is a lot more like the doldrums, where there is no wind and there are no waves. There's no motion. You actually kind of create it by your habits.
Welcome to the Habit Podcast, conversations with writers about writing. I'm Jonathan Rogers, your host. Jen Pollock Michel is the author of several books and the lead editor of Imprint Magazine. She hosts the Inglewood Review of Books podcast. She's also raising 5 kids, all while living in Canada. Her new book is A Habit Called Faith. I thought that would be a great fit for the Habit podcast, and I was not wrong about that. Jen Pollock Michel, thank you so much for being on the Habit podcast today.
I am really looking forward to chatting with you again.
And I'm excited about your new book that's coming out. I guess I'm going to try to release this about the same time that the book releases, A Habit Called Faith. And I got excited when I saw that title, of course, because I'm interested in habit. I've named my podcast The Habit Podcast. To quote, Flannery O'Connor said, "I'm a full-time believer in writing habits." And so let's talk about habit, because that's really what your book is about, forming habits, or I guess maybe I shouldn't say, maybe is that fair to say it's about forming habits, or is it rather a vehicle for forming a new habit?
I think it's about the idea. I mean, yes and yes, sort of. I think it's about forming the habit of Bible reading, but it's also about thinking of faith as a habit. I think a lot of times people think of faith as built by epiphanies, those sort of mountaintop experiences. And sometimes we don't make the connection all the time between just regular practices and formation of faith. And we also don't think about the practices as a way into faith. So I got really interested in this idea that I just ran across in a book, because I don't read, it's Pascal, but I can't say that I was actually reading the Pensée. I was just reading somebody else who had read the Pensée. And Pascal had said, there are a lot of people who they resolve all of their intellectual questions about faith, but they still don't have faith. It's not anything that's vital. They're sort of convinced on a rational level, but they're not practicing the life of faith. And he said, you actually have to practice the motions of faith to kind of move your way into faith. And that felt really intriguing for me. I think especially the context that I live in, I interact every day with people who don't really think that the faith life is possible for them. Maybe they don't have a lot of reference to it. Maybe they just sort of imagine that it's kind of this like emotional superpower that you have to sort of see what's behind the clouds. And I think this idea of habit as a way into faith, not just as a way we practice faith, but the practice is being actually a door into faith is a really encouraging thing for some people.
Yeah. It's interesting that you're talking about Pascal as the entree into that, because I think of Pascal's wager as being the sort of intellectual, thought experiment, basically. What is it? The idea of the wager, Pascal's wager, that if you wager that God exists and he doesn't, you haven't lost anything. But if you wager that he doesn't and he does, you've really lost. That's I've always found that slightly distasteful, right? The Pascal's wager, but it had never occurred to me until I read it in your book that the thrust of that is, let's live this way and see what happens.
Absolutely. Yeah, I had a really fun interview that I did. Well, some of the things that I include in the book are these faith stories, just the different ways that people come into the life of faith. And one of them is actually a bishop from South Carolina in the Anglican Church. And he started to become intellectually convinced about the coherence of Christianity, not necessarily the personal relevance of it, but the coherence of it. And then he just made sort of that wager. He got that wager up and he said, I'm going to sort of act as if God is real. I'm going to just make that my premise and sort of move into a way of being. And then God became very real to him. It's a cool story.
Yeah, I love that story. Well, on a related note, another thing you said in your book is that knowledge is informed by what we expect to see. And so your challenge to the reader is, why don't you expect to see God for the next 40 days? That sounds a little bit like some sort of relativism, right? Knowledge is informed by what you expect to see. And so there, I've made an accusation. You're talking like a
You're a relativist.
If that's not relativism, what is it? This idea that our knowledge is informed by what we expect to see, which, by the way, is just true, right?
Yeah, I was going to say, that's just a sort of borne out by research, that we all kind of have these biases, these sort of narrow ways in which we see the world or expect to see the world. And so the world we expect to see is the world we actually see. And so it takes a little bit of training. It takes a little bit of intention. And I would say deliberate practice to sort of see beyond what we expect to see. And I think that's true in the life of faith. Again, if you come from a really sort of naturalist perspective, you don't expect to see God. You don't expect to see anything that's sort of outside the laws of nature, the regularity of, gravity. You expect to see things that are predictable and understandable. And so I'm inviting readers into expecting to see something maybe beyond that. And it's a way of, it's actually entering the biblical landscape, which subverts all of our expectations for what we think really, the natural world. Again, if you're a naturalist, you don't expect to see the Red Sea parting, manna falling from the sky, the signs and wonders, kind of idea that both Deuteronomy and John, which are the two books that I'm using in the book, though that's a huge thread, a motif in both of those books.
Yeah. That observation that we what we expect to see shapes what we see and shapes knowledge reminds me of something. I think it was Chesterton, but I've never been able to track it back down. He said that the materialist is like the materialist who doesn't see any wonder in the world is like the policeman who's ordered everybody into the house, into their houses after curfew, and then writes in his notebook, "The streets are suspiciously quiet tonight."
Yes, that's exactly right. I think that's exactly right. And we have to invite people into practices. I mean, this is again just a real interest for me because I live in a context where just faith is not the obvious choice. I live in one of the world's most cosmopolitan cities, and I would say just on average, the average Torontonian, really doesn't have a lot of reference to faith. I mean, maybe, great grandma or grandma went to church, but there's just a very different history here. There's a very different kind of cultural reference to Christianity. And so inviting people into a practice where they actually, they change what they see. And I think that is what Bible reading can do for us. I think a lot of times we think of it as sort of informational. But if we think of it narratively, like as a story that sort of shapes our expectation of the world that we have, you know, I mean, as soon as we enter into the landscape of Scripture, we're in a totally different world than the one that we would normally expect to see if we only came from that kind of materialist, naturalist perspective.
Yeah. Okay. So this, as I think you know, is a podcast about writing. So I do want, without sort of turning, your book into writing lessons, I'm interested to hear about your habits, since this is a book about habit. Tell me about your writing habits, and I'm especially interested, for instance, are there ways that as a writer you go through the motions, like your habits help you go through the motions even when you're not feeling it, you're not feeling inspired, or you're not feeling.
Absolutely. I mean, I think if any of us waited for that kind of inspiration to fill the sails, we might be waiting for a long time. I think life is a lot more like the doldrums, where there is no wind and there are no waves. There's no motion. You actually kind of create it by your habits. So there's all kinds of ways that I create kind of wind, I guess. I mean, I think, again, if you sort of take that, like, if we could wait for the wind, or we could paddle, and the habits are a little bit of the paddling. So I create writing assignments for myself all the time.
Really?
I do. I think about my monthly letter to readers as just a writing assignment. Yeah. And I think of, I journal. I'm a regular journaler. I should say that I actually have become much more of a journaler in the pandemic, because I think writing is a careful paying attention. It is the disciplined habit of paying attention to a lot of different things. And just as a writer who is very interested in the spiritual life, I pay a lot of attention to what's going on inside of me, as much as I try to pay attention to God and, Scripture and things that are going on outside of me. But I'm very interested in the intersection of those things. So journaling is a habit it's a spiritual habit. And I also think it's a writing habit because it is a way that it's actually a way that you get beyond spectating. I think as a writer, you have to move beyond spectatorship. And I feel as if our world is just built on the habits of spectatorship. And to get beyond that, where you actually sort of move into even the habit of forming your own opinions, of noting your own reactions, of sort of taking account of your own fears and worries and longings and desires, like all of that is super important. So I have a journal, like I'm doing regular examine every day. I'm just asking myself literally the same questions every day, and I'm writing. And I'm not just like thinking in my mind, I'm actually taking up a pen and paper. Pen and paper is a huge kind of foundation for most of the writing habits that I have. I try to get away from my computer, especially really early on, because I find that I just freeze up, that I have all these kind of expectations that I bring with me that, well, this better be good and this better be soon make sense. And there's just a way that the computer only allows you to kind of draft and think in very kind of coherent, linear ways. And I have to get beyond that. So I keep messy notebooks. I actually keep a couple of different notebooks. I keep a 3-ring binder, which is where more of my journal is. I keep, and other things that I sort of put in there, but I am definitely like a lined notebook, paper, fountain pen kind of person. I have a moleskin. Yeah. Do you as well?
I write with pen and paper, and tends to be graph. I like the moleskins with graph paper.
Okay.
For me, and this is probably some sort of superstition on my part, but it feels like when I'm really producing and having to, meet a deadline or whatever, it takes me the same amount of time to write one page, whether that's like, whether I have wide lines or narrow lines or the tiny lines of a graph paper. And so again, this is some sort of mental game I play with myself that if the smaller the lines, the more I can produce, because it takes me, 45 minutes to write a page or whatever, and I've written more if it's got smaller lines.
I love that.
Mean anything.
But there is that sense of having to trick yourself. You actually have to take up habits that sort of maneuver around whatever your particular hangups are.
Yeah. Yeah. And you said fountain pen? You use a fountain pen?
I'm a fountain pen person, not for everything, but for my journal and for my Moleskine. And then I've got another notebook. My Moleskine is like, just sort of that paying attention to a lot of different things. I heard this on this podcast. Here's that sermon I listened to. Somebody said this. It makes me wonder this. I'm formulating an argument here in my mind. Does this work? It's a sort of a working out of ideas. But then I have another notebook that is not my fountain pen. It's just it's a spiral notebook, and it's my throw the spaghetti on the wall. Like, it can be super messy. I can tear out the pages. I can write in whatever pen I want. And I need some sort of canvas for that. Yeah. That's my kind of trick for getting around. Oh, you better think something really clever, and it better be the first thing that you actually write down.
Yeah. That's interesting. There was something you said made me want to ask a second question, a follow-up question, and that is, how much do you go back to these notebooks that you write?
That is a habit I think I'm actually trying to cultivate more now. The problem is, do you want to know, I literally wrote like 300 pages, like front and back, probably for the year of this pandemic, with journaling, just really wanting to sort of keep a record of just all kinds of things. It was sort of like my historical account of what was happening. And I've scanned those now, and I've put them in my computer, and I think, you know what? I don't think I'm going to go back to those a ton. I sort of flipped back through, and then I drew out some things where I noticed themes. I'm really, I have been, continue to be so intrigued by the idea of the way we live in time. I mean, that was just sort of all the anxieties that I've had over the pandemic have been related to time. And so I started to just like notice that, and then just keep a separate list, so I don't study it. I think the Moleskine is a new thing for me, which is a place where I hope to go a little bit more back to more frequently. I've found that I struggle sometimes to just create pitches. I want to write an article, but then I don't have it gathered well enough to kind of think about what have I been thinking about. So that's what I'm hoping to do a little bit more there. But I do think that there is a benefit to it, even if you don't go back to it.
I do too. Yeah. And it seems like, when I write down little ideas, I don't do this as much. Like, they used to write on scraps of paper and then lose them, but it always felt like they came back right when I needed them. I was casting the bread on the waters, and then they would just turn up.
So true.
Right. It was strange.
And books are that way too. Maybe you order a book, you buy it, and then you're not as you don't need it exactly when it comes, and you put it on your shelf, and then maybe you don't pick it up for another year. I have had that experience just recently with the book where I thought, I'm really glad I have this book. I didn't really pay much attention to it when it actually arrived.
Yeah. I know the feeling. And by the way, what's the relationship between the spiral notebook, right? Whatever the spaghetti on the wall notebook and the Moleskine?
So the spaghetti on the wall is, it might be just a really messy sort of working out of an argument. It could, it can actually go both ways. So maybe the Moleskine is, I read this essay and they were making this argument. I'm not sure if I agree with that. Maybe then I go to the spaghetti on the wall notebook and I just make a list of things like, here's how I take issue with what they said. This sounds like I'm such a critic, but I think writing you're in conversation.
Yes.
Always with other writers, other books, and you're reacting to maybe, and the only thing that you really can, there's nothing to write if you just agree with everything.
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
So maybe the moleskin is sort of, oh, I read this. This is the argument they formulated. Then the spiral notebook is how am I interacting with that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And then maybe the next step is maybe my laptop, where it's okay. I think I actually could sort of piece together something coherent, like a response to that.
Yeah. So you have mentioned already the idea of not being a spectator.
Mm-hmm.
And the way you talk about entering in a conversation with other writers, and I think it's important that readers think of themselves as being in conversation with the writers that they're
Absolutely
reading, right? Not just, even if you don't plan to write, we're always in conversation. And I think you're kind of talking about the same thing, right? That's another way of saying the same thing. Not being a spectator is acknowledging that you are in dialogue with other thinkers. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, that's absolutely fair to say. And I think I'm coming so late to this habit. I don't know. It's really weird how you can get through like undergraduate school and graduate school and still not cultivate that habit. And I think there's part of it being honestly a woman. I think makes me there's a formation that we have, especially as Christian women, where and it's implicit, it's tacit. And I don't know, I imbibed it in a way that I'm only now just kind of wrestling with. I mean, I think that writing for me is just this practice of sort of saying, wait, I can take up a little space in the world. I can have an opinion. I could, and there's a lot of courage involved in that. There's humility too. I mean, this is not just about, well, now I'm on the world stage and I get to proclaim my, wisdom to everyone. But it's a deliberate entering into the conversation. And that is a way that we're formed. There's a testing that happens as we sort of, articulate something, lend it to others' scrutiny, enter into the conversation, have our thoughts and ideas challenged and changed. I think I've just realized that as a spectator, if you don't get into the game, like if you're just sitting on the bench, well, you're not developing your skills. You may not be failing. You may not be that guy who our kids were watching a football game this past weekend, and it was like somebody had fumbled. I think they were catching a punt. They fumbled, and of course, the other team recovered and scored because they were literally on like the 3rd-yard line. And if you sit on the bench, you can avoid those humiliating moments. It's so safe. Yeah. But golly gee, like I think I'd rather just take a few tumbles and actually like learn and grow. And for me, that's what moving beyond kind of a spectator position means.
Yeah. You mentioned that being a woman has affected your, willingness to step in, and your willingness to be a producer or a non-spectator. Are you aware of ways in which your being a woman has affected the way people receive what you've written? Is that something you're conscious of, or is it more on the production end?
That's a great question. I think I struggle. I think I'd be speculating, honestly, to really say. I've been grateful for just the enthusiasm, both for men and women for my work, on a small scale. Yeah. But I think sometimes people might have a hard time sort of situating me. I think if you have a position, like I think this is what a lot of men enjoy, enjoy institutional affiliation, and women do too, but this is just something I don't have. I don't have institutional affiliation. I don't have a credentialing especially in theological education. So, sometimes I wonder, I guess, if other people wonder, well, what business does she have sort of writing on these things? And I've tried to, over the last several years, just sort of like inhabit the role of the writer. Because a writer is not an academic necessarily. a writer can exist in a lot of different forms, right? You know, there are writers that are academics and scholars. There are writers that are cultural commentators. There are writers. I mean, this is a long tradition, actually. Yeah. I was just before we got on the podcast, you know, we have the testimonies of Perpetua and Felicity. What was her name? The servant. Anyways, I was thinking about these writings that exist from women from they're very, very old, you know, these testimonies, this witness bearing that women have done for millennia.
Right.
And so I want to be able to try to inhabit that. But I don't know that I always sometimes I feel as if I lack models, categories. I struggle to name it exactly.
Yeah. I have to say, I mean, when I've read your work, it has not occurred to me to wonder or to judge your work based on any credentialing, right? I read Surprised by Paradox, which I thought was so great. And I, especially your distinction, between mystery and paradox. That has been, I mention that all the time, by the way, to people. And hopefully I'm not misquoting you. Probably not. You do talk about the difference between mystery and paradox.
I do. Okay. Absolutely. You're right.
It's embarrassing if it turns out that's something. And there's something about the fact that, again, it didn't occur to me I need to look up and see if she's really, been to seminary or whatever. It was like, this rings true. And I love, I mean, as you say, being a writer, being academic that's two different things. And I was an academic, and then I had to sort of unlearn some of those things to be the kind of writer I wanted to be.
Isn't that interesting?
And so, for what that's worth, I mean, this is, that's not just me encouraging you. I mean, hopefully you find that encouraging, but I think for other people listening to this podcast who don't have the academic credentials, well, if you're telling the truth, that's one of the great things about an article or a book being out in the world. It speaks for itself. And if it rings true, it rings true. And if it, I've read plenty of things by people with academic degrees that were just poppycock, right? and didn't in any way, make my life better. And it might have helped them get tenure. I don't know, but it didn't do anything for me. And it's hard to imagine it doing anything for anybody else. So anyway, I just offer that up as an encouragement. And I happen to have a PhD, and it doesn't do me any good in terms of my writing world. I mean, isn't
that interesting? Maybe habits of study or there's some I think that is something really important for writers, and something that I feel like I'm continuing to try to grow in is if you think of writing as a kind of witness bearing that we bring into the world, we bear witness of our lives, we bear witness of reality as we see it. But it should even just sort of return to an earlier thread in this conversation, we have to inform our witness bearing, right? I would be limited if all I offered were the world as I see it and know it right now. Right. I have to enter into the discipline of study that informs, what is there, but what I don't yet see.
Right. Thank you for that distinction, because, there's a difference between habits of study and academic credentialing. So, well, good. I want to talk about, we haven't even talked about sort of really what the idea behind your new book is. Here are 40 days of readings that if you complete this, there's a good chance you will have formed some new habits and may have a new way of thinking about God and the Bible and these sorts of things. And so at one point, you are quoting or paraphrasing a Canadian composer named Ian Cousin. Is that how we say his name?
Yes. Yep.
And he talks about the importance of finishing. And that's one of the things you say in your introduction is, I just want you to, dear reader, I want you to finish this 40 days of, of reading. And so he so this Ian Cousin talks about the idea that the real lessons of making are often, they come in the latter part of the project. And so it's so important to finish for that purpose. And I just wanted to talk about that a little bit in our waning minutes of our time together. Finishing. Why is that so important?
All the momentum, usually of a project is at the beginning. You haven't met any obstacles or any challenges. And so, I guess I could sort of use an example from this last year of how few books I finished. I did a lot of starting and I didn't finish a lot of things. And I don't know, curiosity waned. And I think there's an argument for saying, if your curiosity wanes in the middle of a book, put it down, or maybe you start a writing project, and you realize, this isn't actually going anywhere. So there are arguments to be made for putting things down. I just think we probably rationalize too early why we should put something down. And, so I can give an example of a book I just read, and I can certainly talk about what it's like to write a book. But a book I just read, Leslie Jamison's The Recovering. It's like 500 pages on her movement into sobriety. And it's too long, truthfully. And I read some reviews after I read it, and other reviewers were saying this was too long. But there was a lot of beautiful stuff at the end of the book that I would have totally missed. And I would have really missed how she was putting the whole thing together if I had only read the beginning, or if I'd sort of left off in the middle. So you just can't appreciate the arc of something, the scope of something, the structure of something until you get to the end. And I think that happens in book writing too. I think there's a lot of discovery that happens along the way. And the epiphany sometimes, honestly, even as a writer, writing the book, you get to the end and you've arrived, but you see the map, and there's a lot of epiphany that can happen there. And so it's this tension of because I think there are real times where we can put things down. But I think cultivating the habit of just sticking with something too, sometimes maybe it's not even that the project itself survives. Maybe you finish it and you realize, actually, this still isn't that great. Yeah. But what did you learn along the way? What did the process teach you? What new thing can you bring into the next project? And one of the things that I'm trying to do now is actually just to record more observations in finishing. So noting kind of what I learned through the process of doing something, or what obstacles did I meet along the way? And until you get to that finish line, you can't actually even draw those conclusions. Yeah. But those conclusions are what can help you for the next project.
Yeah. Yeah. Sarah Groves talks about every time she makes a record, she hits a point where she feels like, this is going to be a disaster. What was I thinking? I can't go on. And she calls her mother, and her mother every time says, you call me every time. And we have this conversation. So just a reminder that we had this conversation, for all your previous records, and they were beautiful. And so, and that's the sort of thing that you don't know until you push through it.
That's right. And if you start to notice some of your patterns, you can actually talk yourself down off the ledge.
Yeah.
Like I always get to this point in the project where it feels like nothing's making sense. I mean, that for me happens a lot. I start into something with a very clear idea, and then it gets more muddled the further I get into it.
Yeah.
And then what do? Then you're faced with the muddle and the lack of clarity. And that's where you want to put it down. And if you can just get to the point where you say, well, this always happens. And what do I do when this happens? Oh, yeah, maybe I go back to, for me, a lot of times it's going back to the outline and actually sort of like, you think of an outline often as something that you begin with, but it's something that I actually sort of revise a little bit along the way, because
absolutely.
I need to just return to it. I need that sort of scaffolding.
And that muddle happens because you now understand some things you didn't understand before.
That's right.
I mean, it's, when you just barely know what you're talking about, things can be pretty clear.
Yes, that's right.
And then you learn more, and you're thinking, I don't know and it's true. That's not just an optical illusion. You really do understand. You really are muddled. And then
yes,
and then if you push through, it's a little less muddled.
Mm-hmm.
And I was talking about this with Lisa Deem yesterday. She's going to be on the episode the week before your episode.
Oh, great!
And we were talking about this idea that when you wade in, you don't know where your argument is going, and whatever that argument was at the beginning, probably isn't the best argument you've got.
That's right. I mean, it's sort of like it is an argument for actually changing your mind. A lot of times we are afraid to do that. We're afraid to challenge what we think we know about the world. We think that assertion is like the most honorable of virtues, but to assert something and then to realize that you were wrong about it, that you were misinformed about some things, that you neglected that your knowledge of something was totally partial. Mm-hmm. Of course you should revise and re-see and rethink. Yeah. It's just scary to do that, because then you realize this is actually going to be way more work than I thought it was going to be when I set out.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. One more thing I want to ask you about before so this is the penultimate question. We'll have the last question here in a minute, and you know what that is. But I want to know, so, in your talk of habits, so often we think of habit as being something that's rote, automatic, I don't have to think about, which is, in some ways true. Where's the place of joy in the habits that you're talking about?
I think, habit is a way into joy. I think that we have this idea that like joy will come about spontaneously. We think that if we live our lives extemporaneously, that somehow we're just going to arrive at the things that we derive the most joy from. But instead of thinking of joy as actually something that you practice, habit is the hinge of the heart, is what James K.A. Smith puts it. And I think often we start with desire. We want a certain thing. We want to cultivate, I want to be a better writer. I want to be a better mother. I want to be a better friend. Sometimes we just start there. But what is going to carry you from intention into the actual joy that you already have identified would be true? I mean, we want the things that will ultimately bring us joy. And habits are what carry you there, and I had a friend actually who sent me a poem recently, a collection that I had recommended to her, Anne Porter's Living Things. And she sent me a poem, and it's about this Polish woman, Stella Rapowski or something, I don't remember her name, and how she just does the same thing every morning. And her every morning is a faithful copy of the one that came before, is the idea. And she's a little sister of the sun, I think is the image. Oh, and wow. So my friend sent this to me, and I thought, oh my gosh. And she said, this just reminds me of you. And I thought, she must think I have the most boring life ever, because I am kind of habituated to certain things. I do practice a lot of rhythms and routines, but you know what? I do those intentionally as connected to the places where I think will bring me the most joy. Mm-hmm. I'm not practicing things that I think are going to make my life worse. I'm practicing things that might feel hard in the moment, but I think on the other side, they actually have flourishing in real life to offer to me.
Yeah, great. All right, last question. Who are the writers? I know you've answered this before when you were on this podcast last year or the year before, whenever that was, but who are the writers who make you want to write? Maybe this has changed since last time
I know. I was trying to remember who I had said last time. Well, I've recently been reading and talking about Jasmine Holmes' book, Mother to Son, on Instagram. And what a powerful book. I interviewed her yesterday, and I said, how do you have so much courage as you write? I really admire writers with courage who don't seem like they're trying to placate all the kind of constituencies of opposition. And, she's talking about Black being a Black woman, and there are a lot of constituencies that, have differing opinions. And so she is very courageous and unequivocal in that book. And I think very nuanced. I think she actually maintains a lot of paradox in that book. So that is a book recently that I've just been thinking, I could really learn a lot from Jasmine. Karen Stiller, did you have her on the podcast? I can't remember if
No.
She is a Canadian writer, and she has a wonderful memoir called The Minister's Wife. And it has such a powerful voice in the memoir. It's just very, it's unadorned, it's just kind of the nakedness of the human voice, without pretension, without apology, without, again, sort of placating, the crowd to think a certain kind of way about the narrator. I really enjoyed that memoir, and I've been thinking about a memoir project myself, and I thought I'm going to definitely go back to Karen's book. And then Mark Buchanan is actually another Canadian writer. And I have not read a lot of his things, but I was recently at an event where we were both talking to writers, and I loved his approach. I was kind of talking about writing the things that which we know is kind of one of those big rules. Don't write about the things you don't know. And he said, well, I actually write about the things I want to know about, that I follow my own curiosities as I write. And he, I think, is a very lyrical writer in the spiritual formation genre. And I just recently got his book. Well, after that event, I bought his book God Walk. So I'm really excited to read that. And then, of course, I'll just leave you with those three.
Yeah, those are great. I want to, and did Mark Buchanan write a book called The Rest of God?
Yes, he did. Mm-hmm.
I love that book.
Yes.
Yeah, that's a great book. Okay. Well, I guess we're done here. We're not really done. We're just sort of out of time. We could talk for a long time.
Yeah.
But thank you, Jen. And I hope a lot of people read and benefit from your new book, A Habit Called Faith.
Well, thanks so much, Jonathan. It's always a pleasure to talk to you and to listen to the other conversations you host.
This podcast is brought to you by The Rabbit Room, where art nourishes community and community nourishes art. And all our podcasts are made possible by the generous support of our members. To learn more about us, visit rabbitroom.com. And to become a member, rabbitroom.com/donate. Special thanks as well to Taylor Linhart for letting us use her song Diamonds as the theme music for Season 3 of the Habit Podcast. You can learn more about Taylor and follow her work at taylorlinhart.com.
The Habit membership is a library of resources for writers by me, Jonathan Rogers. More importantly, The Habit is a hub of community where like-minded writers gather to discuss their work and give each other a little more courage. Find out more at thehabit.co.
If you've enjoyed this podcast episode, consider joining the Rabbit Room membership. Your membership helps sustain this community, funding everything from publishing and podcasts and theater productions to events and programs that support artists who create with a Christ-centered vision. We'd love to have you on board. Learn more at rabbitroom.com/member.